Okay, so now we're done with deficit. We're going to talk about federal debt. Now we're on to debt. Total public debt as a percent of gross domestic product. So, as we know, as we've learned, gross domestic product, GDP, is the sum total of all goods and services that a country produces. And if you add all that up, all the goods, all the services that a country produces, you would get GDP. Every country has one. We're looking at gross domestic product, total public debt as a percent of gross domestic product. So these variables here on the side, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, 140, these are percentages. And we can see that here, percent of GDP. So we see throughout time, it's been relatively stable, even during recessions. We can see early on in recession periods, obviously, spending does go up. As we've learned before, spending has gone up during recessions. Post-recessions, spending goes up. And as we can see, as the economy, because we know what we know about recessions is that the economy worsens. So with the economy worsening, we can understand that GDP ultimately goes down. Total output gets worse, productivity gets worse. Obviously, there's layoffs, there's less output. So we can see with recessions, GDP goes down, spending goes up. And so that ratio ultimately gets higher. Let's look at the Great Recession. The Great Recession of 2008, the housing crisis of 2008. We could see that there's a stark, we could see that there was a stark increase in spending, and also with the worsening of the economy, GT, GDP ratio spiked to 90%. 2011, 2010, 89%, 90% in 2011. So we started from 64% and we went way up to over 90% in 2011. That was just a little over a decade ago. And as you can see, since the Great Recession, we've never really been able to recover. We've been well over 90% since. And I'm going to talk about what that implies, what being the percentage point being high, what that implies for a country. Ultimately, if your debt to GDP ratio, if your debt to GDP ratio is high, it indicates to other countries your reliability to pay back your debts in the long term. So, I'm going to describe in this video later that the general GDP debt to GDP ratio, an accepted ratio would be around 77%. I'll describe that later in a few minutes, but as we can see, since the Great Recession, we've been well over that. I mean, if we could see at this graph, 60%, well, we've been under 77% for the majority of American history. And since the recession of 2008, we've never really been able to recover. And here we go with our peak in quarter two of 2020, 134%. So way over 100%, 134%. And then finally, quarter four, last quarter of 2022, 120%. So I'm going to describe how the economy and the national debt, how they're related, their relationship in a few minutes. But on this graph, we can really see how during times of recession, how, spending goes up, the economy gets worse, and ultimately that debt to GDP ratio goes up, and it never really recovers. It generally the percentages get higher and higher as our debt gets higher and higher. So it's on this graph we can get a visualization of how they're related from the national debt and the health of the economy, how they're related to government spending. So now we're going to talk about the GDP and the national debt and their relationship a little bit more. Right now we're on thebalanceeconomy.com. The national debt right now, 31.38 trillion in January 2023. So right now we're going to talk about the national debt and how it relates to GDP and what that pretty much implies. Briefly, Essentially, a country with a high GDP to debt ratio, it indicates their reliability to pay back their debts in the long term. But we could talk about it here. How does the national debt affect the economy? So we know now that the GDP is the total output or the sum of all goods and services that a country produces, right? So how does the national debt affect the economy? Um, when the national debt hits the debt ceiling, it puts the nation in jeopardy of default. Congress must raise or suspend the debt ceiling to prevent that. But that also just means that the debt to GDP ratio continues to increase to unhealthier levels. So whoops, with the last quarter of 2022, quarter four 2022, we were well over 100%. We were 120%. So, again, must raise a debt ceiling to prevent that, but as just also means that the debt to GDP ratio continues to increase to unhealthier levels. So, what would be an indicator of an unhealthy level, a ratio? Well, we have here around 77%. Investors worry that default when the GDP to debt ratio is greater than 77%. That's a tipping point, according to a study by the World Bank, which found that if the debt to GDP ratio exceeds 77% for an extended period of time, it slows economic growth. So we can already see now how the economy and the relationship, how they are very intertwined. So it's a very complex issue, such as like a slowing of output, or Congress needs to be careful with if they decide to cut spending too much, it can ultimately slow output even more, and the GDP can lower. For a period of time, it slows economic growth. Every percentage points of debt above this level cost the country 0.17 percent points in annual economic growth. So we see how there's less output, it affects the GDP, when ultimately can and the whatever the government decides to do with their budget can impact impact the economy even more. So this just says the multiple choice has high level of national debt dampens the economic growth over time. We just talked about that, but now we can talk about interest rates. The Congressional Budget Office found that an increase in 1% point in debt as a percentage of GDP could raise interest rates by 2 to 3 basis points. Let's talk about interest rates. Higher interest rates slow the economy because businesses borrow less and don't have the funds to expand and hire new workers. So it slows output, which can reduce demand. As people spend less money, businesses may lower prices, which means they may also make less money. So less demand and less output. When that happens, the risk is layoffs. All of this could cause a recession. The national debt becomes a sovereign crisis when the country is unable to pay off or lower by paying its bills. So, as we can see, it's a complex relationship. Congress needs to be careful with their fiscal policy. It has an impact on the economy in the terms of interest rates and slowing output, or affecting output and affecting the demand. And overall the health of the economy. I found this interesting because we just recently went through the debt ceiling conversation post the midterm elections. So we're in March 2023 as of today. If you're looking this sometime in the future, you probably know what I'm talking about. The historical midterm elections and the game that Republicans played with the debt ceiling. So I found this interesting. How can we reduce the national debt? To reduce the debt, well, there's two ways. To reduce the debt, according to this, to reduce the debt, the country could raise taxes and or cut spending. So either raise taxes or cut spending to reduce the overall debt. Spending cuts come with pitfalls, though. In 2021, government spending was 30% of GDP, which is the value of all goods and services produced in a country. If the government cuts spending too much, GDP will drop and economic growth will slow, as we just talked about. If you cut spending too much, output will slow down, over and the it will impact the overall health of the economy. That leads to less revenue and a larger deficit. So output slows. There's less government, and in turn, in consequence to that, there's even less revenue for the government, and we could see how things get worse. Tax increases can also slow economic growth. One study found that a tax increase of 1% lowers real GDP by about 3%, which we just read. The real GDP is an inflation adjusted measure that simplifies tracking the GDP from year to year. So as we can see, it's a complex situation. We just recently had the national debt ceiling conversation about a month and a half ago, and I found this interesting. It is, I mean, Republicans suggesting that we just default on our debt, which would be catastrophic. It would probably, or most definitely, lead to a recession, mass layoffs, uh, interest rates would spike. I mean, other countries would never trust the United States to pay back its loans ever again if we ever decided to default. But with that said, we can understand that when it comes to the national debt, it is a careful game that the government must play, um, in terms of uh, bettering or minimizing damage to the economy as much as possible, and minimizing the risk of spiking interest rates too much so that output doesn't slow, and affecting everyone and the economy.